Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jaw and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
We have a great show lined up for you today. We're going to kick it off with the current battle on encryption. And so Adam and I have talked about governments and how encryption has been kind of the bane of law enforcement and doing data discovery and all of that. And so the latest battle against encryption is coming from the UK government, where they gave an order to give UK officials blanket access to iCloud users' encrypted backups. And allegedly, the order didn't even just apply to UK users, it really demanded an access for all users worldwide.
And one note you don't have in here, Andy, it also prevents Apple from disclosing when they receive those requests. So Apple cannot say, hey, Andy, we received a request from the United Kingdom government to access your iCloud data. They're not allowed to confirm that as well.
Yeah, and it is their policy to generally respond to law enforcement requests for data. And they have for years. If you have a lawful warrant or subpoena, they will respond. iMessages themselves have been end-to-end encrypted since 2011, but iCloud backups were not. And so if you are backing up your iCloud messages, which a lot of people do, that's one way to get iMessages across your different devices, as well as if you change a device, you can
get your history,
get all of the history that you had, right? And so it is very useful to have your iMessages backed up. But if you did, then law enforcement with a valid subpoena or warrant would be able to access those unencrypted iCloud backups and receive at least the messages that you back up, which most people have backing up on a really like a nightly basis, so daily basis. So you might miss like a single day. And famously, the San Bernardino shooter case where the FBI was trying to get access to those text messages, they had already gotten the iCloud backups, but they were trying to get the latest text that criminal might have sent during the day, which had not been backed up yet. And so that was like one of the famous cases of law enforcement versus Apple. And of course, Apple did not budge on that. And the FBI was able to recover them, I believe, using some other third-party cracking tool.
Celebrate.
Yeah.
I think it was who they worked with. Or maybe it was that one of those groups in Israel. Anyhow, doesn't matter. They got somebody to crack it.
Exactly. So that has been kind of the cat and mouse game for many, many years. In 2022, and Adam and I did cover this and talk about it, Apple implemented an end-to-end encryption for iCloud backups. It's something called Advanced Data Protection. It's built into iOS. It is not enabled by default. However, if you do enable it, it does do end-to-end backups for end-to-end encryption for your iCloud backups. And that really renders the kind of the compliance that Apple has with governments a lot less useful than it did before. You get an encrypted blob instead of the actual raw data. And, with current encryption and current computing power, that's really not something that can be cracked within a reasonable amount of time. So I think it's been really like when we talk about Apple's stand and really any tech company's stand against a backdoor to end-to-end encryption, it's not really about like standing up to government, so to speak, but really just taking a stand for security baselines in general. Because we know that if you make a backdoor, it's going to be something that not only is accessible to the governments, but also to anyone, specifically cyber criminals and threat actors. They will exploit it. It's not even just an if, but it's really a when it will happen. Anytime we've built some sort of weaker, this is really, history has proven, we've had weaker standards for encryption back in the day where the government mandated that we had weaker encryption and, that was cracked, and now we have stronger encryption. And so really, this is just about basic security. And it's really wild to me that governments still don't understand this. They think that if we create a backdoor just for them, then they'll be the only ones that get it. Maybe they don't follow.
It's that whole nerd harder thing. Like, oh, just the nerds haven't worked hard enough on this. If they would go nerd harder, they could figure it out. And it's like, it doesn't work that way. It's, it's not possible, but they keep wishing it would be. And, the other thing, Andy, too, is it's obviously it's willful ignorance on the part of politicians, which is par for the course for politicians. But the other thing that's interesting to me is they do generally understand statecraft and geopolitical relationships. And if the United Kingdom asks for this and Apple has to legally comply with the laws of the United Kingdom where they have a significant business, what's to stop the next nation from asking for the same thing, i.e. China? Apple would be put in a very difficult position because they rely on China not only to manufacture the lion's share of their devices, but of course they also sell a ton of devices there. And so it's not a big stretch for them to say, if you're going to provide the UK this level of access, we'd like that too, please and thank you. And then it just spreads from there. So it becomes this not just like a technical problem, it becomes a geopolitical problem where if one nation gets it, the other one wants it too. That's where that state of nobody gets this, there is no backdoor, is really the only tenable position. And, to be clear, we are not confirming that Apple has provided a backdoor to the UK. Actually, we'll get to what they've done, in just a minute. But I just wanted to add that note too, is Andy, you laid out all the technical argument against why there can't be technical mitigations to this, why you can't just create a backdoor for the good guys. And I was trying to remember, Andy, I swear on the show recently, we're doing a news show, and there was some example where there was some backdoor that was exploited by threat actors that had originally been put in only for the quote unquote good guys. And I remember at the time I pointed out and said, see, this is why you can't do that. And I wish I could remember what that example was, but there are real world examples of this where someone has put in some sort of backdoor and it's been exploited by threat actors.
Yeah. And this is something that I think security teams can also think about and apply to whatever policy that you're doing, whatever technical controls that you have. Anytime you have some sort of exception, you got to think about how that might be exploited. And I know most organizations do, but this includes like your admins, which is why like some tools like just-in-time escalation with approval processes are important, because you're not giving people just blanket rights or privileges across the board all the time, because it may not even be them that are, if they get their identity compromised, obviously, so that can, either an insider threat or a compromised identity or something like that can spawn into an attack that is, unnecessary if you had some sort of other control in place. So that's how I would look at it from a InfoSec organization.
Making it relevant. That's a really good tie back. I mean, the perfect canonical example is executives demanding less security protections than the rank and file, when in reality, they should have more, number one. But number two, kind of the same theory I just laid out between nation states. Well, it could be against members of the C-suite. You give the CEO an exception where they don't have to use VPN to access this, or they don't have to change their password, although you should do password rotation, whatever. You create some sort of exemption. Next thing you know, the CFO comes and asks for it. Next thing, the CMO comes and asks for it, so on and so forth. Next thing you know, all of your C-suite members and most of your vice presidents all have this exception in place because they talk to each other. Like, it's where, again, like having a policy of nobody gets exceptions, nobody gets backdoors as much as possible, recognizing reality. And at the end of the day, you have to do what the CEO tells you. As much as possible, we don't want to carve out those exemptions because it only takes one, right?
So what
did Apple do?
What did Apple do? They did not really comply, obviously, with the order. They did not create a backdoor, but instead they disabled advanced data protection in the UK to new users and current UK users. And any current UK user that has it enabled will have to disable the feature. So for UK Apple users, some of the iCloud data is still encrypted, like your iCloud keychain, your health, your iMessages, and FaceTime. They will still have end-to-end encryption by default. However, other iCloud services that are encrypted as part of the advanced data protection, effective immediately, including iCloud backups, iCloud Drive, photos, notes, reminders, Safari bookmarks, Siri shortcuts, voice memos, wallet passes, and Freeform are all going to be unencrypted and disabled from that advanced data protection. So it's pretty unfortunate that this is a thing, but that's what Apple had to do in order to basically say, same thing, like you said, we're either going to create a backdoor or we're not. And that would be for everyone involved. And so instead of creating that backdoor, they just said, okay, unfortunately, all people in the UK cannot use this feature.
Right. It's kind of a going back in time before advanced data protection rolled out to where all these services are not end-to-end encrypted. Apple also holds decryption keys, and they always have. And the reason why Apple has is really for user experience. You forget your Apple ID password, you need to reset it. You don't have access to any of your devices. They can still get you back in. When you turn on advanced data protection, it makes you go through several hoops to validate that, like, hey, by the way, if you lose all these things, like, you can't get this back. Like, it's on you now. You control the keys. We're not controlling them anymore. So Apple did not turn that on by default. I think fairly so, in service of their customer base and their kind of customer experience they tend to deliver. It was not ever to enable governments to have this standing access, if they show up with a valid subpoena or legal warrant, but it does enable that as well. So Apple kind of went back to the future to somewhat comply with this. And what's interesting is if you go read the actual Apple statement on this, they never mention why, which again goes back to what I was referencing, where Apple, by this request or this law, cannot even acknowledge why, that it is involved in their decision making. So Apple's statement is very like passive voice, which is unusual for Apple, actually, where it says something to the effect of, Apple can no longer offer advanced data protection in the United Kingdom. We are disabling it to new users effective immediately, and existing users will need to disable it on their own. And we'll provide guidance on how to do that, as well as reminders that they must complete that process. Eventually, we will disable their ability to back up to iCloud if they don't comply. The reason why Apple can't turn it off for those users is because they don't have the keys. They can't just, if Apple could turn it off on their own and gain access to it, then that would solve the problem. But then that's not true end-to-end encryption where you control all the keys. So users, by the way, who have it turned on in the UK must manually and take their own human-initiated process to disable that. That's also another key point here as well. And then one final point of clarification, because this gets a little confusing, and what you said was accurate, Andy, but I just want to unpack this for users. You said some data will still be encrypted, iCloud keychain and health, iMessage and FaceTime. To be clear, what that's talking about is that iMessage is end-to-end encrypted during transmission, and FaceTimes are end-to-end encrypted during that session being open. However, iMessages are also included in the iCloud backups, which you mentioned are not encrypted. So as far as that iMessage history, what this effectively does allow the United Kingdom government to do is go show up to Apple's door with a valid legal request of some kind, and then gain access to your iCloud data, which is encrypted at rest, to be clear, in Apple's data centers or in third-party data centers. Apple does actually work with like AWS and Microsoft to store some of that, or actually I think a lot of it's GCP today. Anyhow, but they do hold keys to decrypt that. So they would actually be able to produce your iMessage history unless you turn off iMessage in the cloud, which would be your other option if you're in the UK, to make sure that that isn't easily accessible to law enforcement over there. So, kind of a sad day for sure, especially, Andy, we just did our last show where the FBI here in the United States is encouraging people to use end-to-end encrypted communications. And we unpacked how RCS kind of is on Android, but not on other platforms. And, platforms are end-to-end encrypted like WhatsApp and Signal, and then Telegram actually is not, even though they kind of claim it is. And yeah, we talked about it on the show that the FBI is now encouraging people to. So it's one of those as the world turns kind of thing where the story is kind of constantly evolved, but still disappointing that this has happened, and concerns about how this has trickle-down effects over time.
Yeah, an easy way, if there are newer folks that are listening to the show, to kind of explain this is how I explain it to a lot of people who might not be in cybersecurity, is end-to-end encryption is like you own the house and you have your own key for the house, and only your key can open up the house and nobody else has that key. Whereas the way that, you're going back to it, where a lot of our data is, like Gmail is a good example, right? Gmail, you have your own password and everything get into your Gmail. However, Google still holds the overall key for that. So it's like living in an apartment complex where you do have a key for your own apartment, but the landlord has another key that can open up everybody's door when there is a specific thing that they need. In this case, a law enforcement request or something like that. So they can still get in and provide access.
That is a phenomenal analogy. I love it.
And then the other thing I wanted to mention, because we did talk about end-to-end encrypted communications on a previous show, and Adam, you just brought it up. Signal is kind of interesting in how that works, because we talk about how iMessages have backups and you get the history and all that. Well, Signal doesn't back that up. And so when you do get a new iOS device and you want to put Signal on it, it does not have your content history. It starts a new thread. And this is the same thing if you were to sync your Signal thread to like another device, like on the Windows application, it doesn't include the history. In fact, it has none of your threads populated to begin with. However, for a device like iOS, they do provide now, and this was not provided when it first started, but now you can do like a QR code and transfer your previous history, but you have to have obviously both devices to transfer the history from one to another. And so they have a way to do that now, but it asks you in the beginning, would you like to transfer or would you like to basically start new? And you can still have all of your contacts and your threads and all that, but it just has no history. So that's legitimately end-to-end encryption because it's a new device and starting a new key and everything like that, right?
Right. Yeah. There's the device-to-device transfer if you want it, which is slow and painful, but does work, but they don't have it on server side at all. And that's how they stay unencumbered by stuff like this, is just don't even have it. But Signal, of course, also is by its nature far less user-friendly than Apple service, where you get a new iPhone, you send it with your Apple ID, and all your messages are there. And it's just like magic. I mean, and you get why they want to do this and why advanced data protection is even not on by default, because then they really want you to like enroll some FIDO2 keys to store your keys or whatever. I mean, it's complicated and you can lock yourself out really easily. And no matter how much you go to the Apple store and scream at the poor genius there, they can't fix it for you. No matter how many sternly worded letters you write to Tim Cook, they can't fix it for you. You know, you're in charge. And so you get why it's not on by default, but by nature, it creates this attractive attack surface. In this case, attack surface for law enforcement. So, you know, it's something to keep in mind. And the analogy, again, tying it back to our listeners, is this is why I always argue against things like SSL decryption, because I think that's more attractive attack surface and it's going to store a bunch of stuff in memory, even if it's transient. That's very attractive to attackers. And I'm just highly skeptical of the value you get from that versus the risk you create from it. So, you know, I mean, think about it, even when you are creating more convenience, are you also creating an attack surface? So are we going to move on to our next topic?
We are. And if you want to give
I'll give the old disclaimer here before we do. So Andy and I both work for Microsoft. We're in our field sales, security sales business. Andy, by the way, recently took a new role. Congratulations, Andy. He's now in our Microsoft Federal part of the world, helping support the United States government and specifically our military. So congrats on the new gig. But we're still in security sales, still working our field. And we do this show, as I always say very flippantly, on our own time, on our own dime. And just what I mean by that is literally we're not doing this during work hours generally. And we certainly have invested a lot of our own funds to do this show. So it's not under the purview of Microsoft anymore. Then of course we want to stay in good graces of our employer and not badmouth them on our show. That's a career limiting move. And certainly we're not going to do that. But what we like to do, of course, talk about what you know, but also look at things through an academic lens. And so that's when you take something that could have competitive aspects to it or could be relevant to our day jobs and be exciting news for our day jobs. But instead of looking at it through the like lens of how does this help me sell more stuff or how is this good or bad, just looking at it through like, what are the facts? What can we learn from this? What can we unpack? So, you know, 6 months ago, we did a show about the CrowdStrike incident where they had a major disruption to their ability to provide services and took a lot of Windows machines down in the process. And we viewed it through an academic lens. CrowdStrike's a tough competitor, but we looked at it through like, what are the facts? What happened? What can our listeners learn? So that's when we bring up stuff like this, I just want to reiterate, that's what we came to this show to do, is unpack stuff and look at the facts, look at the story of what's going on and help bring learnings to our listeners, or if nothing else, things to think about. And so with that, Andy, let's talk about the most recent MITRE evaluation for endpoint protection platforms that dropped in December.
Yeah, so MITRE released their enterprise evaluations. There were quite a few participants. I won't name them all, but you know, some of the usual suspects are there: Microsoft, Palo Alto, Cisco, Checkpoint, Bitdefender, Sophos, SentinelOne, Trend Micro. So, and then a couple other ones that I've actually never heard of, like with Secure and WatchGuard. And so there were quite a few. Notably missing was CrowdStrike. They typically do participate in these evaluations and do very well. However, I believe that the evaluations were happening around the same time of that outage that Adam mentioned. And so I think they were not able to complete it because obviously that was a worldwide debilitating event. And so they are not on this year's evaluations.
Understandably so. I think they had their priorities in the right place. Good job, CrowdStrike. We look forward to competing again next year.
Yeah. And so, Microsoft published a blog on the results. And I'm sure if you go to whatever vendor participated, they're going to have their own spin on how they did. But as far as Microsoft...
But by the way, MITRE doesn't like pick a winner, right? Like they kind of just, here are the facts. Here's how everybody performed. Here's how they did. And then there's not like a winner. There's not like a magic quadrant or something where you can be like, look at us, we're the dot in the most upper right. So that's why it opens the door to each company kind of cherry picking their own metrics and claiming victory in these exercises. But you can go unpack all of the data for yourself. That is what's cool about these is MITRE publishes all of it. MITRE is a nonprofit organization. And so you can go dig into the metrics that are of interest to you and see how everyone performed in a standardized testing format. So there is value there for sure.
Some of the things that I'm going to pull out of this blog that I found interesting was a Defender XDR demonstrated 100% technique level detection across all attack stages for Linux and Mac OS threats. And that's also interesting because there's a new extended Berkeley packet filter Linux sensor, or eBPF, and Mac OS behavioral monitoring engine. And I think just educating a lot of users that we do have Mac and Linux capabilities. They are very, very good. And this kind of demonstrated that. There was also 0 false positives across all operating systems. And they talk about Security Copilot, which is really the industry's first generative AI for security. And that helped out in this evaluation as well. So it allowed some of the analysts to translate obfuscated PowerShell scripts into like explanations on how it worked in the cyber attack. And then finally, MITRE added ransomware as a category, and Defender XDR demonstrated some visibility into remote encryption, where you're able to provide visibility into encryption attempts from remote machines that are not even onboarded by XDR, which puts an end to one of the most advanced cyber attack vectors that Microsoft has data on being used in over 70% of the recent ransomware cases where an attacker is using a compromised device or their own device to encrypt other devices on a given network. And I found this really interesting, so I wanted to dive in just a little bit because we're literally looking at devices that are unmanaged and not onboarded by your current XDR or EDR solution, in this case, Defender. And so I wanted to kind of understand how that worked. And so one of the capabilities that Defender for Endpoint has is the ability to do behavioral monitoring of unmanaged devices on the network. And so this is kind of, if you have a device that is onboarded with Defender for Endpoint, it does, of course, look at the network that it is sitting on. And if there are some sort of behavioral signals coming from the network itself on devices that are coming from that network, we have IoT monitoring, but also other types of signals like looking at fileless malware or command and control or beaconing or large amounts of DNS requests or something like that, that may indicate that that device is compromised. And so MDE actually has the ability to quarantine, not necessarily, quarantine is really not the right word to use here, but kind of block off an unmanaged device from communicating with a managed device. So obviously an unmanaged device, we don't really have control of that, but we can control the managed device from communicating with the unmanaged device.
Tell all of them, stop listening to them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the ways that Defender kind of handles unmanaged devices and signals coming from that. There's also, of course, the full XDR suite where we have control of, the identity and everything. So we look at pre-ransomware activities like initial access or reconnaissance, lateral movement, credential theft, and all of that, and also try to prevent ransomware from happening. And then finally, the one thing I wanted to highlight, which is something that is unique to Microsoft, and we've talked about this before, is automatic attack disruption. This is a capability that's marketed and kind of built into Defender XDR, Defender for Endpoint, but really it is an identity protection solution, because what it does is it looks at compromised identities from, say, Entra or your Active Directory, which we monitor through Defender for Identity. And if an identity becomes compromised, so either through manual remediation where the analyst will go and disable that identity, which is pretty common. Like if you have a identity that's compromised, obviously you want to disable it. If you're disabling it on-prem, it has to sync to Entra Connect, which takes time, unless you kick off manual DIRSync. And then that will have to propagate across all of your domain controllers, as well as finally get to the endpoint where that identity is being used. And there's a time frame, right? The Kerberos ticket has a time frame, or the access token has a time frame. And so when that access token is still valid, the attacker can still continue to have access to whatever resource that they're using and continue to propagate the attack. Automatic attack disruption does is it sends a signal from our XDR portal, and it is high confidence. So this, I think a lot of questions come up where, why doesn't this get sent as soon as we know or whatever? Why do we have to wait for so many alerts to happen before this actually kicks off? Well, it's high confidence. It has to be like, we know for sure this is a compromised identity before it kicks off, because what will happen is you can have Defender for Identity disable the identity on-prem. You can have Entra disable it in the cloud, but then sending that signal via Defender for Endpoint to the endpoint itself, it will lock out that user from a current active connection, like an SMB connection or an RDP connection or an SSH connection. It will lock them out. It doesn't have to wait for that identity to propagate and say, oh, this identity is disabled. And then finally, when it tries to reinitiate the access token and says, oh, the identity is no longer valid, it sends it right away and cuts off any active connections. And so this is really kind of the whole suite working together to prevent a compromised identity from continuing to propagate with some of the limitations of how identity works. But we're taking advantage of our security as a suite and the Defender for Endpoint kind of built in to take that action. Something that, as you're using Defender XDR, this is something that you want to keep in mind. It's already built into the platform. There's nothing that you have to enable by default. And there are exceptions. So if you want to configure it, there is a section within Defender XDR that you can go and configure how you want attack disruption to handle things. You can exempt certain things from it taking action on, but by default, it's turned on for everything. And so when I saw this bullet on, we demonstrate deep visibility into remote encryption, providing unprecedented visibility into encryption attempts originating from remote machines that are not even onboarded to Defender XDR, I thought, wow, that's pretty cool that they put that in there. And how do we do it? And so I listed off a couple of the things that really have an advantage on the Microsoft Defender platform.
This is the perfect example of where we are highlighting our differentiators at Microsoft, and how we talked about the different vendors. We'll kind of cherry pick their different highlights. These are obviously ours. Overall, like having the 100% detection across all the different attack stages and techniques. Microsoft has done that on Windows for years. Pointing out that it's now happening on Linux and Mac OS is interesting. I think, people in cybersecurity tend to have and so they think of Microsoft stating Linux as a cancer and stuff like that. And, people have this weird perception in their head that's kind of skewed on Microsoft and Apple's relationship over the years, because the fact is, Microsoft is the longest standing developer on Apple platforms of anybody that exists. Like Microsoft was there day one for the Apple II, day one for the Mac. And Microsoft remains the largest Apple developer in the world outside of Cupertino. People forget that and think like, oh yeah, Microsoft hates the Mac. They always do half, fill in the blank support for Mac OS stuff. And it's like, it's really not true. There's a ton of people that use Macs at Microsoft. They're fully supported clients. Andy uses his to do his day job for sure. I have in the past. I'm currently Macless at the moment. I sold my Mac Mini to a buddy, friend of the show, Joel Spikuza, and need to get a new one. But the point stands that if you have this perception in your head of like Microsoft hates Linux and doesn't do good support there, Microsoft hates the Mac and doesn't do solid support, this should at least change your perception. And again, like this is not, I talked about, like we're trying to look at this academically. And so those are academic facts. Like you can go verify those on the MITRE site. You don't need to get those from the Microsoft blog summarizing our highlights. You can go get them from anywhere. But as you're doing your evaluation of how do I best secure my organization, operating with false assumptions based on like past history or past hurt feelings is not an effective way to operate. And as we always talk about on this show, security defenders, above and beyond anybody else, must operate with a growth mindset, with that ability to take in new information and replace outdated or past assumptions about information. And so we're just trying to empower you with, hey, here's the things we did well, here's differentiators. And so as you're evaluating your strategy for how you protect, those are things you should take into consideration. And hey, there's other vendors that have things like identity protection in place. Like CrowdStrike is a very good on-premises identity protection solution. It's worth asking your CrowdStrike vendor, your CrowdStrike rep, if you're on them, hey, how do these work together? How do they share signal? How can I use identity signals to take additional protection on the endpoint and stop ransomware and vice versa? Because you understand Microsoft has it. And as I always say on this show, the rising tide lifts all ships. And Andy even called this out when he was on the Microsoft Security Insights show a couple weeks ago. And I heard you say it, Andy, and I smiled because I knew you got it from me. But it's true, right? If Microsoft is upping the game in automatic attack disruption, these other vendors can't sit still. They need to match that or come up with their own solutions for it. And at the end of the day, as defenders, we all win when that happens. So as we talk through this, all really good things to know. But then just to pivot here, Andy, and I thought this was funny, Microsoft writes this blog post saying, yeah, we kicked some butt at this evaluation. We are so good. We detected everything on Linux, Mac, Windows. We're awesome. And by the way, this test sucks. And I'm like really oversimplifying it, and they actually unpack it, and I'll let you walk through it. But I thought that was really funny to at the same time say, we kicked ass at this test. And by the way, this test sucks. But I will say before you unpack this, I had kind of picked up on this for years. When I would read like the way MITRE ran these evaluations, it always sounded really odd to me because they would be like, you turn off all automated preventions. You run like -6 version of your product. So it's not current shipping state. It has to be like multiple versions back. Like these Windows machines have to be intentionally unpatched. Like for Microsoft, this was a lot of work for us, by the way, in previous evaluations, because we ship updates to the Defender agent with cumulative updates for Windows. And they would be like, no, you need a Windows server that's unpatched, and is missing the last 3 months of patches. And it's like, well, but you want the most current version of the detection engine, but you want an unpatched Windows server. Like that doesn't exist for us because we ship those together. All right, well, I suppose you can backport, your current engine to like a previous cumulative update, and you can run that even though that's never been seen in production. And so like we used to have to jump through hoops to support their really odd evaluation logic here. And Andy, I'll let you unpack that more now. But the concern is these evaluations are not entirely based in reality.
Yeah, a lot of times when I look over these blogs, I kind of scan them, but this really jumped out at me as I read it. And it basically said, I'll read some of it verbatim. This year, our conclusions from the MITRE protection test is that it was designed to evade protection mechanisms to the extent that it is unrepresentative of an actual cyber attack, a methodology that Microsoft disagrees with. And so, yeah, I don't think as Microsoft, we don't really think that the evaluations are based in reality. And they dive a little deeper in the blog, and it says really the core issue is micro-testing methodology, which is inconsistent with how cyber attackers typically operate, moving laterally within organizations by gaining access to identities and privileges over time. The broader signals are critical for distinguishing between benign and malicious activity so we can balance protecting organizations from cyber attacks while supporting the broad set of benign use cases across a massive customer base worldwide. And one of their examples was that MITRE starts with a highly privileged user that's already compromised, an application signed by a trusted certificate to conduct cyber attack steps in isolation without any other adequate context. And we go on to write like signed apps are executed by privileged users is a benign scenario, which we see on thousands of Windows machines a day. Using a trusted certificate isn't suspicious unless the associated user was compromised, context that MITRE test lacked. And the signals were not provided to enable us to determine that the certificate in the trusted root authority had been compromised or was seen signing a malicious application. And so there were some recommendations as part of this test. And Microsoft basically wrote, we're not going to implement any of the recommendations because if we did, it would impact essentially thousands of organizations across the world because they're looking at this from a very narrow point of view and in this controlled environment and not really across the use cases. And Adam and I always talk about that where we're very conscious, like we even talked about in the show here, where we understand exceptions happen. Like you cannot have a 100% secure solution without some sort of exception. That's just the reality of the situation. I don't think I've ever implemented any security solution, even MFA. Like we say MFA 100%, but that's not really true. Like we will have exceptions to MFA because there has to be. Like if you're using a service account, like it's not really feasible to tie MFA to a service account unless you're using a shared, device, or you put that MFA code into a shared repository, which then of course opens up other attack surfaces, so on and so forth. So there's always some sort of compromise with security no matter what. And so I think in this case where you're looking at it from a very narrow point of view, it's just really not based in reality, which we wrote in the test. Like we played along with your game, but we think the game is rigged, essentially is what we said.
Well, two quotes come to mind. Number one, there's this great 1997 movie, Liar, Liar, starring Jim Carrey. And at one point, the concept of the movie is he's a lawyer who cannot lie, has something happen to him and he can't lie. I don't remember why that happened. I think his son wishes his dad couldn't tell lies anymore. He's in court at one point and, Your Honor, I object. On what grounds? Because it's devastating to my case. And so keep that in mind. And then the second one is the standard quote, and I'm going to kind of modernize it. To the person who only has a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail. So the problem is the cybersecurity industry as a whole has always operated on this model of these companies that show up and they're good at one thing really well. And so cybersecurity up until this point, in recent history, and when I say recent history, I mean the last 5 to 10 years, has been a bunch of organizations that are focused on one thing. So they love siloed tests that look at only one domain because that's where they can be successful. And MITRE, of course, is an organization made up of other organizations that all kind of have a say in it. It's a consortium. And all these other companies, you named them, Andy, Sophos and SentinelOne and Qualys, and Palo's actually a platform play too, but Checkpoint, Bitdefender, Cybereason, a lot of them, Trend Micro, they're mostly one-trick ponies. Sounds dismissive, and I don't mean it that way, but they have one area in which they really excel. And so they're involved in the decision-making process. They love these kind of micro-segmented tests that test like one thing really well because we got heads down and built that. Why do they not want tests that look more like real-world tests that mimic attackers crossing domains? And why does Microsoft want that? Because it's devastating to my case. Again, it goes back to that. And I'm not arguing that there's a conspiracy here or anything like that. This is organizations operating in their own best interests. The problem is their best interest in how we traditionally done cybersecurity is at odds with how we need to do cybersecurity today. And so that's where the platform vendors, the Microsofts and Palo Altos of the world, and CrowdStrike's trying to build a platform over time, they might more see the value to this approach. But you've got a lot of vendors making a lot of noise that this would be devastating to their case because they don't have that signal. They don't have an identity play. So how would they know that the certificate had been signed by a compromised identity? They don't in many, many cases. And then you, as a security defender, need to ask yourself, how does that impact my ability to secure my organization? And that's where, a common theme on the show, and again, maybe influenced a little bit by who signs our checks and how we succeed, is that we need solutions that scale across domains as we try to stop defenders, or we at least need solutions that are designed to work together, even if they're from different vendors, to do that. I think the dream of I'm going to build all this logic in my SIM and SOAR to do this automatically is frankly a pipe dream. You don't have that talent or that time to build that internally bespoke to your organization. And why should you when it's already been invented too? So that's my theory as to why it's happening. And again, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's organizations acting in their own best interest, but it's just a nature of the cybersecurity industry has not really seen the level of integration that would be required for more organizations to adopt this approach. And again, outside of really Microsoft and Palo, and to a lesser extent, a couple of other orgs, nobody has that broad enough platform to really argue for this. And so that's why you're seeing Microsoft kind of be a party of one here saying, hey, this test is kind of flawed. We would do even better if we had all this other context to use with it. And we still did really well, but here's where we think, there's some opportunities for improvement. So, MITRE does change these evaluations year over year. I'm sure we'll continue to see this evolved. We certainly, as Microsoft, will get a seat at the table to give our opinion on how to drive it forward. And that will be a story worth following when the next evaluation comes out in a year or so.
I want to take this a step further and just talk about the way that we conduct our own defense evaluations at an organization. I'm going to highlight vulnerability testing. So a lot of times, if you bring in some sort of pen test vendor or whatever, they give you the option of, do you want something that's a box that I put on your network to kind of scan and look for vulnerabilities? And a lot of times organizations do these pen tests because it's required as part of a compliance framework that they have to comply with. But I honestly think that the best way to conduct a pen test is a blind test. So give organizations like a pen test organization the green light to test all of your defenses. That includes physical, like can they impersonate a person walking in and piggyback off of their badge? Do you have security built in there? Will your physical security detect them? Are they able to access your server rooms and put a device on there? Can they social engineer a worker to give up their credentials and then laterally move that way? Because these are ways that attackers will actually do things. Can they send a phishing email to phish a credential from your users and then use that? Because those tests, while they are scary, I think for a lot of organizations, it's scary because you know that when you get targeted, probably with a high level of certainty, you will get breached. And that nobody likes failing. Nobody likes failing in cybersecurity. No one likes to admit that their defenses are inadequate for a targeted attack. But the reality is that most organizations are. And so if you do one of these controlled tests, there's a lot that you can learn from it and help you kind of make a plan to get better at areas that you are weak in. I think using these artificial type pen tests of, let me just put a Nessus or Qualys scanner on the network, give you a rundown of all the vulnerabilities you have. Here's a scan of all your passwords. They're really easy. I can guess all of them, blah, blah, blah. Like actually do a legitimate test to see where an attacker can go. Can they get the keys to the kingdom? Can they get to domain admin? And how do they do that? And we have tools within our suite as well, like Attack Path, that can kind of map that out for you. But a real world test, paying a vendor to do a pen test, there are vendors out there that do that. We had one on our show where we talked about pen testing and physical pen testing and kind of running the gamut of the whole thing. That can be extremely valuable for your security team. Don't just like check a box for compliance. Like let's actually do a test. Only a handful of people know, and go from there. And you're going to probably learn quite a bit and have a good idea of how to map out your defenses in the future.
That's a great call out, because compliance is one of the few times the money tree grows at any organization. Like being compliant is not optional. And so if the money tree grows and there's money to do it, then why do it halfway? And again, I think you hit on all the human reasons why folks are more comfortable with the other approach. And I will say, I'm coming up on my 8th anniversary of Microsoft. And certainly we have had different kind of catchphrases that have been popular over time as I've been here. So in my early days, it was identity is the new control plane. And that's when we're really trying to get organizations out of this mindset of network-based perimeter to identity-based perimeter. And I think most organizations have gotten there. And then for the long time, we had a catchphrase that was, attackers don't break in, they log in, which was to emphasize that if you're going to go to all this work to secure all these like super hardcore, crazy techniques and worry about someone's going to steal my device and like solder the leads on my Dell laptop so they could break through Windows Hello for Business encryption and sniff the bus and get the stuff from the TPM. Like, no, they're not. They're just going to, the old XKCD quote, they're going to drug them and hit them with a wrench over the head till they tell them their password, right? Like everyone loves to get so hung up on these, and it gets back to, if I ask for your password, someone's eventually going to give it to me, which is going to tie into our next subject in just a moment. But I want to tie the loop on this point first. The current catchphrase now is defenders think in lists, attackers think in graphs. That's our new kind of catchphrase internal to Microsoft. But the point of that is defenders will be like, well, my job is to secure email. And so I'm going to check these boxes on my email security and I'm good. And then your buddy next to you is like, I protect the on-premises identity. So I'm going to check these boxes and I'm good. But attackers don't think that way. They're like, how do I get in, get somebody's password? How do I move laterally through identity? How do I get privilege escalation? How do I get access to the cloud? How do I get access to this application and steal a bunch of data and then hold it ransom or whatever? Like they're thinking in graphs. How do I move through the graph of all the interconnected components and resources? And defenders are thinking in this very siloed list. And so that MITRE attack or that MITRE evaluation is endemic of that. And again, it's nobody's fault. This is where our industry has always operated, both in terms of roles and responsibilities inside of companies and how cybersecurity vendors have sold their products. And our point is, and again, we are financially incented to think this way, but I really believe with this vision is you have to broaden your perspective, because if you keep thinking in this siloed sense, you're missing all of these signals that can empower you to make better decisions. As Andy explained, automated attack disruption, that wasn't a sales pitch. It was explaining how these identity signals can be paired with the control of the endpoint and the visibility the endpoint has into unmanaged devices to help protect your environment. And that's like a bunch of technologies coming together. That's Defender for Identity, identity protection on premises, Entra ID protection in the cloud. That is Microsoft acquiring CyberX in 2020, one of the best IoT defensive solutions in the world, and integrating it into the Defender for Endpoint platform so that it can go detect all of those malicious activities on your network. And then it's tying it all together with the Defender for Endpoint platform and bringing all of those together with that cloud backend to share those signals and automatically disrupt that attack, to shut down the on-prem identity, the cloud identity, and then the control on the endpoint as well. And that's not a sales pitch. That's just a thing. It's an example of here's what you can do when you control all these things. And I know we're kind of like belaboring this point, but it's so interesting seeing it come up in the context of this MITRE evaluation and how it's, I'm going to use too strong a language here, but almost like a disease that has infected our industry because of how it has grown up, that we need to move past. Just like we needed to move past network-based perimeter, just like we needed to move past inherent trust to zero trust. We need to move past siloed solutions to holistic platforms for security.
So the final thing I wanted to talk about is
something less that we're going to get less fired up about?
Definitely not. Definitely not.
Boy, let's go.
And it's funny because I actually had a conversation with a friend of mine this week, and she was a little bit annoyed, to say the least, about some of the security controls and tests that her organization was, having them do. She was like, every time I have to put in my password, every time I have to do MFA, and it's just random, like throughout the day, like I have to do that. And so, there's an attitude that users have towards security teams that generally, I would say across the board, is apathy at best, and probably more dislike or, even hate on most levels. And so there was an interesting article that I came across that talked about phishing tests. And of course, like email and phishing, we have had this since the beginning of email, and phishing simulations is something that IT teams have been conducting for probably well over a decade. But the problem is that attackers are getting better at it. And so, there's almost like a one-up type mentality within the IT security teams to try to craft or trick their users into the best type of phishing simulation that they can. And there's actually a Reddit that talks about some of the stories that IT people have. And I'll just read a couple of them because this really kind of irked me as I read them. One Reddit user wrote, "I'm probably the most hated person at the company right now. Happy Wednesday." He said he pushed employees into full panic mode with a mass email telling workers that their password had changed. Another user discussed a phishing test that mimicked an open enrollment benefits link. And he wrote, quote, "It was not well received. Lots of clicks though, exclamation mark." And a user replied, "Dang, that's dirty. I love it." There was a security engineer at NASA who made a staffer cry because there was a phishing test that promised employees a chance to win a trip to the Kennedy Space Center to view the final launch of the space shuttle. And he thought, well, now everybody hates me. And, I thought this was interesting because, Adam and I have talked about this, I think, in general over the years, and we haven't really highlighted it, but phishing has not really gone away. Like, it's still one of the most commonly used attack vectors. And
attackers don't break in, they log in, baby.
Yeah.
We just talked about it.
And phishing simulations, I think, is still very common. I talked to a lot of customers in my previous role. Adam, you talked to a lot of customers in your current role. I'm willing to bet that almost every single one of them have some sort of phishing simulator that they use to phish their internal employees. And so I think the part of phishing education is good, like teaching people what to look for, telling them, when they not necessarily fail, but if they click on something that they shouldn't have. No, I think that's good, but the users are probably more receptive to the education if you haven't made them feel like they're dumb or like they're a fool. There's actually some studies that have been going around that are saying the tests don't even work. There's actually a 2021 study of 1,400 corporate workers that were 14,000 corporate workers by researchers at Zurich University that found phishing tests combined with voluntary training made employees more susceptible to phishing and probably giving trainees a false sense of security. There's actually another follow-up study by researchers at the University of California, San Diego, which looked at a wide range of training programs and found the tests led to a measly 2% reduction in phishing success rate. And so, one of the things, I think this is like one of those flashy metrics that a lot of CISOs and security teams try to prove their worth, I guess, is a way to say it. That's something that you put on your slides to your C-suite and say, oh, we did this number of phishing tests, and you can see over time the click rate has reduced. And maybe that's true. But I'm willing to bet you're never going to get to zero. I'm willing to put money on it that there's going to be no tests that you put out there that have a 0% click rate. And so it kind of comes down to what's the point and what are you trying to do? This article ended with a final example, and that just really set me off. Apparently, the chief information officer at the Lehigh Valley Network, Health Network, said that the tests don't work unless there's real life consequences. And so the employees at his organization, when they fail a phishing test, they actually lose external email access for 3 months. The second time they get cuts for a year, and the third they're fired. So I think, and he said, he hasn't fired anyone. He said, I'm not sure there's a cure. If you want to cure it, you keep your job. That's a big yikes for me. Like, having that sort of punitive damage or a consequence does not sit well with me. I think you do need to have phishing education. I think that's important, but really it's just to spot like the most common things. Part of it, you're also depending on email security, like a secure email gateway in order to filter out kind of the known bad. But that's why we have security in layers. You have managed devices, MFA, phish resistant to MFA, so on and so forth. And so if you're implementing all the things that we recommend, like if I gave you my username and password, and we've talked about this before, if I even click on a link for my Microsoft email and it takes me to a site to put in my username and password, I immediately know that something is wrong because we have single sign-on implemented, we have passwordless implemented, we just don't use passwords. If I gave you my password at Microsoft, you can't do anything with it. Because if you try to enroll a device, we have MFA required. We have phish resistant MFA for everything that we do. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing you can do with just a simple phishing email. So what is the point? We need to move past that and certainly not have these type of phishing simulations and punitive results where you're going to lose your job if you click on a phishing link. That's just absolutely terrible to me. There are better ways to conduct security. And if you are one of these teams that have this type of mentality where you're celebrating tricking users into like some email that you crafted, you need to seriously change your attitude and find a better way to do that, because users are not people that you are trying to like trick. That's not the whole point of a phishing test. You want to teach them the basics. That's what phishing simulations are. The basics. That's it. Spotting where the text doesn't match the URL or some sort of language trigger where, you know, the English isn't correct or whatever. And that's getting better because of AI and everything. And of course, like the URL is never going to match because you have solutions like Proofpoint or Mimecast where they rewrite the URLs. And so like you hover over that. So it's like some of these signals won't even matter in a corporate environment. So teach users the basics, have a layered approach to it, and have a way that where at Microsoft, again, if you had my username and password, nothing you can do about it. Even if you had a device that you try to enroll, you can't do that. You know, like there's
and
nothing.
Even if you got it enrolled, your manager gets an email and your manager's going to say, Andy, did you enroll a new
Correct.
device from St. Petersburg?
Correct.
No? Okay.
Yeah. So those are things that you need to think past this. And I saw this, and then with the conversation of my friend and how she really disliked their security team, like that's not how I would want to run a security organization. I want to be there to protect our users, and certainly not be like the police of our users where we're like writing, you know, tickets and punitive damage if they like mess up.
So many thoughts here, of course. You knew that was coming. I'll start with, look, we talk about this all the time on this show, but we encourage all of our listeners to adopt a growth mindset. And a growth mindset means you are a learn-it-all, not a know-it-all. And these quotes from several of these people are know-it-alls. They're the worst kind of people to work with. You catch more flies with honey than vinegar, right? This is not the way to get people to your team. And I'm going to also throw back to something I've mentioned many times on this show, but I love this wording. I'm a big believer in language matters. And so I have flown many times on Delta Airlines recently, and in their safety briefing video, there's a sentence that I love, and I will repeat it now. They say on the safety briefing video, let me make sure I get this right. Safety is the shared responsibility of everyone on board. What they are communicating is it's not just the job of the flight attendants or the pilot or just the crew to get you there safely. It's the shared responsibility of everyone on board. If people on board start making bad choices, the safety of the aircraft is compromised. If someone gets up and tries to open a door mid-flight, that compromises the security of the aircraft. If you have an aircraft collapse its landing gear on the runway and flip over, and some people are trying to get their bags out of overhead bins instead of getting off the aircraft, compromises the security and safety of the operation, right? So cybersecurity is the shared responsibility of everyone at your organization. And so treating your users like they are dumber than you and you are trying to trick them is not going to achieve that goal. It is not going to bring everyone together. And so when Andy has someone come to him and vent about their cybersecurity team and the poor perception and relationship they have with them, that is not accomplishing the goal of cybersecurity being the shared responsibility of everyone at the company. Just stop there. So in general, Andy, you nailed it, right? Like the other concept that is so important to understand, and people lose sight of this so many times in life, is opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is any time you are spending time to do something else when you could have used that time differently. And so an easy example to think about is if you spent an hour driving around town to find the gas station that had gas for 2 cents cheaper, not only did you waste your own time, and you're not going to make it back because if you filled up, a 10-gallon tank, you just saved 20 cents, which your time almost certainly, if you do anything in life, is more valued than that. You probably burn more gasoline than you even saved with those 20 cents, right? Like there's opportunity cost. Just go fill up with gas. Like there isn't that big of a differential between gas stations. And so when you spend all of this time trying to drive down your click rate like another percent, and you are being hostile to your users and you are tricking your users and you're creating this gulf of trust between you and your users, that is opportunity cost that could be spent, I don't know, getting to passwordless, getting to phish resistant, implementing credential guard on your endpoints, implementing a zero trust strategy. There are so many things you can do to implement a defense in depth strategy that would be more effective than trying to reduce this another percent and drive it to zero, which is effectively impossible. And your return on investment is so much lower than so many of those other activities. This is something organizations spend too much time on, just like the proverbial person driving around town to find the cheapest gas. Like Andy said, run a phishing test, look for the most obvious signs, train your users on that, and move on. And spend your time on higher value things like teaching everyone that cybersecurity is the shared responsibility of everyone in the organization and implementing these defense in-depth controls, which will do way more value to you. Like Andy pointed out, at this point, you could phish me at Microsoft and there's not a damn thing you could do that makes that valuable to you, because there's nothing you can take from me or I could stupidly give up that would be helpful, because you cannot get enough from me, because we have so much defense in depth at this point between required enrolled devices and requiring phish resistant MFA. And we don't use passwords anyways. And I've forgotten what my password is because I haven't used it or changed it or rotated it in years. All of those things have created more protections than trying to drive down our phishing rate by another percent. We do very phishing exercises at Microsoft. They've been kind of tricky at times. They are not overly tricky or hostile. They are not frequent. And we educate people who fail them instead of punish people who fail them. And by the way, we reward people who successfully manage them too. You get a nice little email that says, hey, good job. You identified that correctly. Great work. Keep it up. And we communicate over and over again. And that's why I've repeated over and over that shared responsibility concept. We're very good at Microsoft about communicating. We need everyone together. And I don't think personally from anyone I've talked to, and I'm not saying we've got it all figured out, but I don't talk to people inside of Microsoft who have this dim perception of our security team. In fact, they're very fond of them because they're very measured in their approach. They're measure twice, cut once. And even as we've gone through our Secure Future initiative, which has been a big change, people are very on board with it. People are very bought in. And so when you have that culture of everyone in the boat together, you're just so much more successful. I just hate this. And Andy, I'll just add an example. This gentleman, Mr. Luis Tavares, the CIO at Lehigh Valley Health Network, he gives his people 3 strikes and they're out. I have a customer here that I cover, and they're 2 strikes and you're out. Strike 1, you write an apology to the entire company for failing a phishing test, and strike 2 is you lose your job. They also file all external emails into a separate folder automatically in their inbox. And so sometimes they're very slow to respond to external emails because they don't see them. So, impacting productivity to such a negative level in service of cybersecurity, it's amazing how organizations fall into that, to me, because cybersecurity is an enabler of the business, not a blocker of the business. And certainly you need to put in reasonable controls to achieve that. But the business is in business for a reason. And we should not be being a drag on that. We should find ways to work with them to enable secure productivity. Andy, I think you and I are both super clear on this. And yes, yet one more thing to get fired up about in an over an hour-long podcast, but we had some great subjects today.
Yeah, and I want to actually give one final warning because this was something that I didn't say when I was first talking about the story, but when I was talking to my friend, the reason why it came up was she's like, yeah, I hate my security team so much that I actually actively look for ways to circumvent their security controls so I can do my job. Like that should be a warning because that's what users do. If you try to impact their productivity, they will actively find ways, and they will find ways. They're very creative on finding ways to circumvent security controls. And so, it is
That's
a shared
us versus them, right? That's when you've created an us versus them mentality. And now no one is operating on the mindset of it's the shared responsibility of everyone at the company or organization.
Yeah. So be weary when that type of stuff happens, and the shared responsibility, I think, is also really good when you build it into your culture. You kind of teach that. I know at a previous organization, security was very, very important and kind of built into the onboarding where you had to badge in individually to each door. And there was one time like the CIO or the COO or something like that was in line, and she like was thinking about looking back and making sure everyone was badging in, even though she wasn't really part of security, but having that whole mindset of everything that we're doing, And there was one other point that I was going to say. Don't be afraid to make mistakes either. Like sometimes you put a security policy in place and you have good intentions, but it's okay to pull that back. And in fact, it just happened at Microsoft. I got an email about how there are some third-party plugins in Teams, and they're like, we're going to ban all the third-party plugins, because there are security risks. And then all of a sudden, there's another email that came out and said, just kidding, we're delaying this because probably something came up that was business critical, whatever it is. And that's okay. If there is something that affects it, the security teams, again, are there to enable the business. So something happened. They wanted to ban it for a specific reason, probably a good reason. There's risks in third-party plugins. But then there was a business critical thing that got escalated, and they're like, okay, we're going to have to reevaluate this. We're going to implement it at a different time.
Great.
Yeah, no problem. You're trying to make the company safer, but you also want to make sure that the company keeps on ticking and have that productivity. So
yeah, I love that call out there at the end, Andy. And that's, again, tying back to like growth mindset versus fixed mindset. Fixed mindset folks want to look smart, and growth mindset people are not afraid to say, hey, yeah, we messed up. We'll do better the next time. We'll figure it out. And like, that's where you need to be. There is way more risk of like digging your heels in than adapting over time and being able to learn and adapt to how you need to run things. And, you know, back when we were all single factor password based, phishing was much more dangerous than it is today, but there's much more ways to mitigate it. And so that's where we need to pivot and change our approach and how hardcore we try to manage this.
Yeah. All right. So longer show than normal, but I think we had a lot of really good conversation today.
Yes.
So thanks for sticking with us. That's our show for this week. Our contact information, along with the links that we used for our material, will be in the show notes. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future, please reach out to us. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.